Victoria Henrietta Hayes stood on the polished marble steps of her father's bank and watched the dusty cowboy count out his meager earnings to pay the interest on his failing ranch. And something deep in her chest stirred with a feeling she had never known in all her 20 years of privileged existence. The year was 1878, and Cherry Creek, Colorado, was a town divided sharply between those who had money and those who broke their backs trying to earn it. "That is all I have, sir," the cowboy said, his voice steady despite the obvious strain in his weathered face. He was younger than Victoria had initially thought, perhaps 24 or 25, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His clothes were worn but clean, and his hands, she noticed, were calloused from honest labor. Her father, Cornelius Hayes, sat behind his massive oak desk like a king on a throne, his silk vest straining slightly over his prosperous belly. "This is $15 short, young. You know what happens when payments are not met in full." "I know, Mr. Hayes. I am asking for just 2 more weeks. The cattle drive went poorly this season because of the drought, but I have 3 horses I can sell. Good horses. That will more than cover what I owe." Victoria found herself leaning forward, her silk skirts rustling softly. She had attended these meetings with her father for the past year as part of her education in business matters, but she had never paid much attention before. The borrowers all blurred together in her mind, faceless people who owed her father money. But this man was different somehow. There was dignity in the way he held himself, pride that refused to be crushed by circumstance. 2 weeks, her father said, tapping his gold pen against the ledger. "And if you do not have the full amount, then I will foreclose on your property, all 160 acres of it." The cowboy's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "You will have your money, sir. I give you my word." "The word of a poor rancher means very little in business, young, but I suppose I have no choice. 2 weeks, not a day more." The cowboy placed his hat back on his head and turned to leave. As he passed Victoria on his way out, their eyes met for just a moment. His were the color of strong coffee, warm and deep, and in them she saw something that made her breath catch. Determination, certainly, but also a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. He tipped his hat to her respectfully, and then he was gone, leaving only the faint scent of leather and sage. "Victoria, stop gawking and close the door," her father said sharply. "We have 3 more appointments this afternoon." She closed the door, but she could not stop thinking about the cowboy. That evening, as she sat at dinner in their grand Victorian house on the hill overlooking Cherry Creek, she finally asked, "Father, who was that man who came to see you today? The rancher?" Her father barely looked up from his roast beef. "Which one? There were several. The young one. You called him young." "Ah, Matthew Young. He has a small ranch about 5 miles west of town. His father died 2 years ago and left the boy with more debt than sense. He has been struggling to keep afloat ever since." Cornelius cut another piece of meat with surgical precision. "He will fail, of course. They all do eventually, and when he does, I will own some very valuable grazing land." Victoria's mother, Constance, patted her lips delicately with her napkin. "Why do you ask, dear? Surely you are not interested in such matters." "I attended the meeting with Father. I simply wondered about the people we do business with." "You would do better to wonder about the Thornton boy," her mother said, her eyes lighting up. "Charles has been asking about you again. His father owns the largest mining operation in 3 counties. They are coming to dinner next Saturday." Victoria suppressed a sigh. Charles Thornton was everything her parents wanted for her. Wealthy, educated back east from a good family. He was also insufferably boring, with soft hands that had never done a day's real work and a laugh that sounded like a braying donkey. She had endured his company at various social functions for the past 6 months, and each time she found herself counting the minutes until she could escape. "That is lovely, Mother," she said, because it was easier than arguing. But that night, as she lay in her four-poster bed with its imported silk canopy, she did not think about Charles Thornton. She thought about coffee-colored eyes and calloused hands, and a voice that remained steady even in the face of losing everything. The next morning, she did something she had never done before. She saddled her mare, Rosebud, and rode out of town toward the west, following the main road until she saw a weathered wooden sign that read, "Young Ranch." The property was modest, with a small house that needed paint and several outbuildings in various states of repair. But the fences were mended, and the few cattle she could see in the distance looked healthy enough. This was a place that was loved, she realized, even if it was struggling. She was about to turn back, suddenly embarrassed by her impulsive behavior, when she heard the sound of hammering. Following the noise, she rode around the side of the barn and found Matthew Young on the roof, shirtless in the summer heat, repairing a section of damaged shingles. The sight of him stopped her cold. His body was lean and muscular, his skin golden from the sun, and there was a grace to his movements as he worked. This was a man who knew what he was doing, who took pride in his labor. He must have sensed her presence because he looked up, shading his eyes against the morning sun. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Then he climbed down the ladder with easy confidence and reached for his shirt, pulling it on as he approached. "Miss Hayes," he said, and there was surprise in his voice but no servility. "This is unexpected." "I was out riding," she said, which was true if not the whole truth. "I did not mean to disturb you." "You are not disturbing me." He came closer, and she noticed that his eyes looked even warmer in the sunlight, flecked with gold. "Is there something I can help you with?" "Is it about your father's bank?" "No, I just—" She trailed off, realizing she had no idea what to say. What could she possibly tell him? That she had been thinking about him since yesterday, that she had ridden out here on some half-formed impulse she did not fully understand. "I wanted to see your ranch. My father speaks often of the properties he finances, but I have never actually visited any of them." It was a weak excuse, but he seemed to accept it. "Would you like a tour? It is not much, but it is mine, or it will be if I can keep making the payments." She dismounted, and he took Rosebud's reins, tying her to a post near a water trough. Then he showed her around the property, pointing out the improvements he had made, the plans he had for the future. He spoke with passion about breeding better cattle, about sustainable grazing practices, about building something that would last. She found herself fascinated not just by what he said, but by the way he said it, with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his own worth, even if the world did not always recognize it. "My father started this ranch with nothing," he said as they stood on a small rise overlooking the property. "He came out here after the war, claimed this land under the Homestead Act, and built everything from scratch. When he died, people told me I should sell it, that I was too young to make it work. But this is my legacy. This is what he left me. I cannot just give it up." "I understand," Victoria said softly, and she realized she meant it. She might have grown up with every material comfort, but she understood the importance of legacy, of having something that mattered beyond money. He turned to look at her, really look at her, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Can I ask you something, Miss Hayes?" "Of course." "Why did you really come here today?" She could have lied. She probably should have lied. Instead, she found herself telling him the truth. "Because I could not stop thinking about you." The words hung in the air between them, shocking in their honesty. Matthew's eyes widened, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face, transforming it completely. I could not stop thinking about you either, he said. Since the moment I saw you standing on those bank steps in your fancy dress, looking like something out of a dream, I kept telling myself I was being foolish, that a woman like you would never look twice at a man like me. Maybe you do not know me as well as you think, she said, her heart pounding. Then I would like to, he replied, if you will let me. That was the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, Victoria found excuses to ride out to the young ranch almost every day. She told her mother she was visiting friends, taking long rides for her health, anything to explain her absences. And each day she spent with Matthew, she fell a little more in love with him. He taught her things she had never learned in all her years of expensive education. How to rope a calf, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to find joy in simple things like a good sunset or fresh bread from the oven. He told her about his dreams, his fears, his memories of his father. And she, in turn, found herself sharing things she had never told anyone, about feeling trapped in her gilded cage, about wanting more from life than endless tea parties and social climbing. They were in the barn one afternoon, Victoria helping him sort through tack, when he suddenly stopped what he was doing and looked at her with such intensity that she felt her breath catch. "Victoria," he said, using her first name for the first time, "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "I sold the horses, all 3 of them, to a buyer from Denver. I got enough to pay off what I owe your father and have a little left over." He paused, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "I am going to the bank tomorrow to make the payment." "That is wonderful news, Matthew." "It is," he agreed. "But it also means I will not have any excuse to see you after tomorrow. Your father will get his money, and I will be just another poor rancher with nothing to offer the daughter of the richest man in Cherry Creek." She set down the bridle she had been holding and walked toward him, her heart racing. "Is that what you think? That I care about money? I think you have never known what it is like to go without it," he said gently. "I think you are a kind, beautiful woman who has been spending time with me because it is exciting and different. But eventually, you will go back to your real life, to men like Charles Thornton who can give you everything you deserve." "You do not know what I deserve," she said, stopping just inches from him. "You do not get to decide that for me." "Then what do you want, Victoria? Tell me, because I am going crazy trying to figure it out." "I want you," she said simply. "I want this. I want to wake up every morning and see the sun rise over these fields. I want to work beside you, building something real. I want a life that matters, not just a life that looks good from the outside." He stared at her for a long moment, and she saw hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "Your father would never allow it, you know that." "Then we will not ask his permission." The words came out before she had fully thought them through, but once she said them, she knew they were true. She had spent her entire life doing what was expected of her, being the dutiful daughter, the perfect lady. But love, real love, was not something that could be arranged or approved by committee. It was wild and unpredictable, and it demanded courage. "What are you saying?" Matthew asked, his voice rough. "I am saying that I love you, Matthew Young. I am saying that I would rather be poor and happy with you than rich and miserable without you. I am saying that if you feel the same way, we should leave Cherry Creek and start a new life somewhere your ranch and my name do not matter." He closed the distance between them in 2 strides and took her face in his calloused hands. "I love you," he said fiercely. "I have loved you since the moment you walked into my life and turned everything upside down. But I need you to be sure, Victoria. If we do this, if we run away together, there is no going back. Your father will disown you. You will lose everything." "I will lose nothing that matters," she said, and then his lips were on hers, and she was kissing him back with all the passion she had been holding inside for weeks, when they finally broke apart, Both breathing hard, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "When?" he asked. "Soon. As soon as possible. My parents are hosting that dinner with the Thorntons on Saturday. Everyone in town will be there. It would be the perfect time to slip away. That is 5 days from now. Can you be ready?" "I have been ready my whole life for you," he said, kissing her again. "But we need to be smart about this. We will need money, supplies, a destination." They spent the next hour planning, their heads bent together over a map Matthew spread out on a workbench. They decided to head north to Wyoming, where Matthew had a friend who owned a ranch near Cheyenne. It was far enough that her father would have trouble finding them, and the friend, according to Matthew, was a good man who would give them work and ask no questions. "I will take the payment to your father tomorrow as planned," Matthew said. "That way there is no suspicion. And I will start quietly gathering supplies and getting my affairs in order. I will pack a bag and hide it in the old oak tree at the edge of our property," Victoria added. "I cannot take much, just the essentials." "Just bring yourself," Matthew said, touching her cheek tenderly. "That is all I need." The next day, Victoria watched from her bedroom window as Matthew arrived at the bank to make his payment. She had wanted to be there, but her mother had insisted she stay home to help plan the upcoming dinner party. She saw him emerge 20 minutes later, his shoulders straight, his stride confident. He had saved his ranch, and in 4 more days they would save each other. The following days were torture. Victoria had to endure dress fittings and menu planning, and her mother's endless chatter about Charles Thornton's prospects. She smiled and nodded in all the right places, all while her packed bag remained hidden in the oak tree, waiting. She managed to slip away twice to see Matthew, and each time they held each other as if they might never let go. "I am terrified," she admitted on Thursday evening as they sat together on his porch, watching the sun set. "What if something goes wrong? What if we get caught?" "Then we will deal with it," Matthew said, his arms solid and reassuring around her shoulders. "But I do not think we will. Your father sees what he expects to see. He expects you to be his obedient daughter, so that is what he will see until it is too late. Have you ever done anything like this before? Anything this reckless?" He laughed softly. "When I was 21, I rode a half-broken stallion in the 4th of July rodeo on a bet. Broke 2 ribs in my left arm. My father was furious. He told me there was a difference between being brave and being stupid, and I needed to learn which was which." He turned to look at her in the fading light. "This is not stupid, Victoria. This is the bravest, smartest thing I have ever done." Saturday arrived with clear skies and a heat that shimmered off the dusty streets. Victoria spent the morning in a daze, moving through her preparations like an actress in a play. Her mother had chosen her dress, a confection of blue silk and white lace that cost more than most families in Cherry Creek earned in a year. She let the maid arrange her blonde hair in an elaborate updo, each pin feeling like another bar in her cage. The guests began arriving at 6 o'clock. Victoria stood beside her parents, greeting each arrival with practiced grace. The house filled with the cream of Cherry Creek society, all dressed in their finest, all eager to eat Cornelius Hayes's food and curry his favor. Charles Thornton arrived with his parents, and he immediately claimed Victoria's arm, leading her around the room as if she were already his. "You look ravishing tonight, my dear," he said, his breath smelling of the brandy he had clearly been drinking before he arrived. "Father and I have been discussing the future. He thinks we should announce our engagement before the end of the summer." Victoria's blood ran cold. "Has anyone asked what I think?" Charles laughed, as if she had made a joke. "What is there to think about? We are perfectly suited." "Your father agrees." "Of course he does," she murmured. She caught sight of her father across the room, deep in conversation with Mr. Thornton. They were probably discussing the merger of their interests right now, as if she were nothing more than a commodity to be traded. Dinner was announced, and everyone moved to the dining room where a feast had been laid out on the long mahogany table. Victoria found herself seated between Charles and a banker from Denver, forced to make polite conversation while her mind raced. She had agreed to meet Matthew at midnight at the old oak tree. 5 more hours. She just had to endure 5 more hours. The meal seemed to last forever. Course after course appeared, each more elaborate than the last. The guests exclaimed over the quality of the food, the elegance of the presentation, the beauty of the Hayes home. Victoria pushed food around her plate and tried to look interested in Charles's boring story about a mining deal. Finally, the dessert course arrived. As the servants were clearing the plates, Victoria stood up quietly. "Please excuse me," she said to no one in particular. "I need some air." She slipped out through the French doors onto the back terrace. The night was cool and clear, full of stars. She walked down the steps and into the garden, moving casually as if she were simply taking a stroll. Her heart pounded so hard she was sure someone would hear it. When she reached the oak tree at the edge of the property, she found her bag exactly where she had hidden it. She grabbed it quickly and was about to head toward the road where Matthew would be waiting with horses when she heard a voice behind her. "Going somewhere, Victoria?" She spun around to find her father standing in the shadows, his arms crossed over his chest. Her blood turned to ice. "Father, I was just—" "Do not lie to me," he said, stepping forward into the moonlight. His face was hard, angrier than she had ever seen it. "Do you think I am a fool? Do you think I did not notice you sneaking off all week, coming home with dust on your skirts and stars in your eyes?" "I do not know what you mean." "I had you followed, Victoria. I know about Matthew Young. I know you have been spending time at his ranch, and when I saw you slip away just now, I knew exactly what you were planning." Terror gripped her, but beneath it was something else. Anger. Years of suppressed anger at being controlled, managed, arranged like a piece of furniture. "Then you know I am leaving," she said, lifting her chin, "and you cannot stop me." "Cannot stop you," he laughed, a harsh sound. "You are my daughter. You live under my roof, wear clothes I paid for, eat food I provided. Everything you have comes from me. Then I will leave it all behind, gladly." "For what?" "For that poverty-stricken ranch hand, Victoria, be sensible. He has nothing to offer you." "He offers me love," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "He offers me respect and partnership and a real life, not this gilded prison you have built for me. Love." Her father spat the word as if it were poison. "Love does not pay bills, Victoria. Love does not keep you warm in winter or food on the table. You think life with Matthew Young will be some romantic adventure, but I promise you, poverty is not romantic. It is grinding and exhausting, and it breaks people." "Then it will break me," she said, "but at least I will have lived first." Her father took a step toward her, his hand outstretched as if to grab her arm, but another voice cut through the night. "Take one more step, and you will regret it." Matthew emerged from the darkness, leading 2 horses. He was dressed for travel, with saddlebags packed and a determined set to his jaw. He positioned himself between Victoria and her father, protective but not aggressive. Cornelius's face turned purple with rage. You dare come onto my property and try to steal my daughter." "I am not stealing anyone," Matthew said calmly. "Victoria is a grown woman capable of making her own choices, and she has chosen to come with me. I will have you arrested. I will have you run out of Colorado. Do you have any idea who I am, what I can do to you?" "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Hayes. You are a man who built an empire but forgot how to see what really matters. You are so busy counting your money that you never learn to value your daughter for who she is, only for what she can bring to your business dealings." "How dare you?" Cornelius hissed, but there was something in his eyes now, something that might have been recognition of the truth. Victoria stepped forward, standing beside Matthew. "Father, I am leaving. I am sorry to hurt you and Mother, but I cannot live the life you have planned for me. I cannot marry Charles Thornton and become a decoration in someone's mansion. I need more." "You will have nothing," her father said, his voice turning cold. "If you walk away tonight, you are no longer my daughter. I will not give you a penny. When this cowboy grows tired of you, when poverty and hardship wear away whatever infatuation you feel, do not come crawling back to me." The words struck like knives, but Victoria did not let them show on her face. "Then I will not come crawling back. Goodbye, father." She turned toward the horses, and Matthew helped her mount. She could feel her father's eyes on her back, heavy with anger and hurt and something else she could not quite name. For a moment, she almost faltered. This was her father, the man who had raised her, who had once carried her on his shoulders and called her his princess. But that little girl was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own mind and heart. "Victoria," her father called out as they began to ride away. She looked back over her shoulder. "When you come to your senses, when you realize what a mistake you have made, write to your mother. She will be heartbroken." "Tell Mother I love her," Victoria said, "and tell her I am sorry, but I am not making a mistake. For the first time in my life, I am doing exactly what I should." Then she and Matthew were riding hard into the night, leaving Cherry Creek and everything she had ever known behind. They rode for hours, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the town. Victoria kept expecting to hear pursuit, to see torches, or hear her father's angry voice demanding she return. But there was nothing except the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves and the vast Colorado night spreading out before them. Finally, as dawn began to paint the eastern sky pink and gold, Matthew slowed their pace. They were in open country now, with rolling grassland stretching in every direction. He led them to a small creek and dismounted, helping Victoria down. Her legs were shaky from the long ride, and her elaborate dinner dress was dusty and torn at the hem. "Are you all right?" he asked, his hand steady on her waist. "I am better than all right," she said, and she realized it was true. Despite everything, despite the fear and uncertainty and the pain of her father's words, she felt free. "I am alive." He pulled her close and kissed her, deep and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, he said, "We should rest here for a few hours. The horses need water, and we need sleep. Then we will push on to Cheyenne." They made a simple camp by the creek. Matthew unsaddled the horses and let them graze while Victoria changed out of her ridiculous dinner dress and into the simple traveling clothes she had packed. It felt symbolic somehow, shedding the trappings of her old life. When she emerged from behind a screen of bushes, Matthew smiled at her. "You look beautiful," he said. "I look like a ranch hand," she replied, glancing down at her plain brown skirt and white blouse. "Exactly." They ate a sparse breakfast of bread and cheese from Matthew's supplies, and then they spread a blanket under a cottonwood tree. Victoria had never slept outdoors before, and she was surprised by how comfortable it felt to lie there with Matthew's arm around her, the sound of the creek babbling nearby, and the wind whispering through the grass. "You think my father will come after us?" she asked quietly. "Maybe," Matthew said, "but we have a good head start and he does not know exactly where we are going. By the time he figures it out, we will be married and settled. Even a man as powerful as Cornelius Hayes cannot undo a legal marriage." "Married," Victoria said, testing the word. "Mrs. Matthew Young. If you will have me," he said, "I know I should do this properly." He sat up and took her hand, suddenly serious. "Victoria Henrietta Hayes, I do not have a ring to give you or a fortune to offer. But I have 2 hands willing to work, a heart that belongs only to you, and a promise that I will spend every day of my life trying to make you happy. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They kissed again, and then they lay back down, holding each other as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Victoria knew they should sleep, that they had a long journey ahead, but she felt too alive, too full of joy and possibility to close her eyes. "Tell me about your friend in Cheyenne," she said. "The one who owns the ranch. His name is Robert Morrison. We grew up together back in Kansas before my family moved to Colorado. He went north 5 years ago and built up a good operation breeding horses for the cavalry. He is a good man, honest and hardworking. I wrote to him last week and told him I might be coming with my new wife. He wrote back and said we would be welcome. Do you think he will really give us work? I know he will. And I still have some money from the horse sale. It is not much, but it is enough to get us started. We will have to work hard, Victoria, harder than you have ever worked in your life." "I am not afraid of hard work," she said firmly. "I am only afraid of wasting my life on things that do not matter." They dozed fitfully as the morning wore on, both of them too weary to fully relax. Around noon, they packed up their camp and continued north. The landscape gradually changed as they rode, the flat grasslands giving way to rolling hills covered in sagebrush and wildflowers. They passed occasional homesteads and small ranches, but for the most part they were alone with the land and the sky. That night, they stopped at a small town called Greeley and found a preacher who agreed to marry them. The ceremony was simple, held in a cramped office that smelled of tobacco and old books. There were no flowers, no music, no guests. Just Victoria and Matthew standing before a weathered minister, speaking their vows in voices that shook with emotion. "I, Matthew James Young, take you, Victoria Henrietta Hayes, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you in poverty and in wealth, in sickness and in health, for as long as we both shall live. I, Victoria Henrietta Hayes, take you, Matthew James Young, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, honor you, and stand beside you in hardship and in joy, in struggle and in triumph, for as long as we both shall live." The preacher pronounced them man and wife, and Matthew kissed her with such tenderness that Victoria felt tears slip down her cheeks. They paid the preacher with precious coins from their dwindling funds and signed the marriage certificate with shaking hands. Victoria looked at her new name on the paper, Victoria Henrietta Young. It felt like a promise, like a new beginning. They found a small boarding house where they spent their wedding night in a tiny room with a sagging bed and faded wallpaper. But to Victoria, it was perfect. Matthew was gentle and patient, treating her like something precious. And when they finally came together as husband and wife, she understood for the first time what it meant to truly belong to another person and to have them belong to you. Afterward, they lay tangled in the thin sheets, and Matthew traced patterns on her bare shoulder with his fingertips. "I will build you a real home," he promised. "Maybe not right away, but someday. A place with glass windows and a porch and a garden where you can grow flowers." "I do not need a palace," Victoria said, turning to look at him in the moonlight streaming through the window. "I just need you." They reached Cheyenne 3 days later, dusty and tired but filled with anticipation. The city was bigger than Cherry Creek, bustling with commerce and the constant movement of people heading west. Matthew led them through the streets to a ranch on the outskirts of town, a prosperous-looking spread with well-maintained buildings and strong fences. A tall man with red hair and a broad smile came out to meet them. "Matthew Young," he exclaimed, pulling Matthew into a rough hug. "As I live and breathe, I got your letter and I have been watching for you. Robert Morrison, meet my wife, Victoria." Robert swept off his hat and gave Victoria a respectful bow. "Madam, it is an honor. Any woman who would marry this ornery cowboy must be either very brave or very crazy." "Perhaps both," Victoria said, smiling despite her exhaustion. Robert laughed and showed them to a small cabin on the edge of his property. "It is not fancy," he apologized, "but it is clean and dry and it is yours for as long as you need it. Matthew, I can use another hand with the horses. The cavalry contracts keep me busier than I can manage alone. And Mrs. Young, my cook, just quit to get married herself, so if you can handle a kitchen, there is work for you too." "I have never cooked a meal in my life," Victoria admitted, "but I can learn." "That is the spirit," Robert said, clapping her on the shoulder. "Welcome to Wyoming, both of you." The first weeks in Cheyenne were the hardest of Victoria's life. She had never realized how much she did not know about running a household. Her first attempt at cooking breakfast resulted in burned bacon and eggs so rubbery they could have been used as slingshots. Her bread refused to rise, her stews were either too salty or too bland, and she once set a dish towel on fire. But she learned. Robert's wife, Sarah, a patient woman with 4 children of her own, took Victoria under her wing and taught her the basics. How to manage a fire, how to judge when meat was done, how to make biscuits that were light and fluffy instead of hard as rocks. Victoria attacked each lesson with the same determination she had once applied to piano lessons and French. Her hands, which had always been soft and pampered, grew rough and calloused. Her back ached from bending over the stove, and her arms got stronger from kneading dough and carrying water. Matthew worked from dawn until dusk, helping Robert with the horses. He gentled wild mustangs, trained cavalry mounts, and repaired fences and buildings. He came home each night exhausted but happy, and Victoria would have his dinner waiting, getting a little better each time. They fell into a rhythm, a pattern of work and rest and stolen moments of happiness. On Sundays, they would walk together to the small church in town, and afterward they would explore the countryside, finding quiet spots where they could be alone. Matthew taught her to fish in the mountain streams, and she taught him to dance, humming waltzes she remembered from her old life as they twirled in meadows full of wildflowers. One evening about 2 months after their arrival in Cheyenne, Victoria was preparing dinner when she suddenly felt dizzy and had to sit down abruptly. Matthew, who had just come in from the barn, rushed to her side. "What is wrong? Are you ill?" "I do not know," she said, pressing a hand to her stomach. "I have been feeling strange for a few days, tired and queasy, especially in the mornings." Understanding dawned in Matthew's eyes, followed by a joy so pure it took her breath away. "Victoria, do you think, could you be with child?" She stared at him, doing quick calculations in her head. "I suppose it is possible, more than possible, actually." He let out a whoop of joy and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around. "We are going to have a baby, a son or a daughter, a family." Victoria laughed and clung to him, her earlier queasiness forgotten in the rush of happiness. "We should probably confirm it before we get too excited." But when she visited the doctor in town the next week, her suspicions were confirmed. She was pregnant, due to deliver sometime in the spring. The news filled her with a complex mixture of emotions. Joy, certainly, at the thought of having Matthew's child, but also fear. She knew nothing about being a mother. What if she failed at this too, the way she had initially failed at cooking and cleaning and all the practical skills a ranch wife needed? Matthew sensed her worry. "You will be wonderful," he assured her as they rode back to the ranch. "You are the bravest, strongest woman I know. Look at everything you have learned, everything you have accomplished in just 2 months. But a child, Matthew, that is different from learning to make biscuits. Children need love more than they need perfect biscuits, he said, reaching over to take her hand. And our child will be loved more than anything in this world. As Victoria's pregnancy progressed, she bloomed. The morning sickness faded after the first few months, and she found herself filled with energy and an odd sense of contentment. She sewed baby clothes by lamplight in the evenings while Matthew repaired tack or carved a wooden cradle. They talked about names, about the future, about the kind of parents they wanted to be. Winter came early to Wyoming that year, bringing snow that piled high against the cabin walls and winds that howled through the night. Victoria had never experienced cold like this, but she found she did not mind it. There was something cozy about sitting by the fire with Matthew, warm and safe, while the world outside was frozen and white. In December, Matthew came home one evening with a package wrapped in brown paper. "I know we agreed not to spend money on anything unnecessary," he said, looking almost shy. "But I wanted to get you something for Christmas." Inside the package was a beautiful shawl, hand-woven in soft blues and greens. It must have cost more than they could really afford, but Victoria did not care. She wrapped it around her shoulders and felt cherished, loved in a way that had nothing to do with expensive jewelry or fancy dresses. "I have something for you too," she said, pulling out a smaller package. Inside was a pocket watch, not new but well made and carefully polished. She had traded 2 of her old dresses from her previous life to a second-hand shop for it. "So you will always know when it is time to come home to me." Matthew opened the watch and read the inscription she had added. "To my husband, with all my love, Victoria." He pulled her close and they stood there in their little cabin, holding each other as the snow fell outside. Victoria thought about where she had been a year ago, sitting in her father's mansion, bored and restless and wondering if there was more to life. Now she knew there was. There was this. There was love and purpose, and the simple joy of building something real with another person. Christmas came and went quietly. They attended church services with Robert and Sarah and their family, and afterward they all shared a meal at the Morrison house. It was nothing like the elaborate Christmas celebrations Victoria remembered from her childhood, but it was warmer, more genuine. These people cared about each other not because of social obligation, but because of real friendship. In late January, a letter arrived for Victoria. Her heart stopped when she saw her mother's handwriting on the envelope. She had not heard from her family since the night she left, and she had not expected to. With shaking hands, she opened it while Matthew looked on anxiously. "My dearest Victoria," the letter began. "I hope this letter finds you well and happy. Your father told me I must not write to you, that you have made your choice and must live with the consequences. But I am your mother, and I cannot bear to have no connection to my only child. I need to know you are safe and well. Your father was furious after you left. He wanted to come after you to drag you back, but I convinced him to wait until his temper cooled. Then he received word that you had married your cowboy in Greeley, and he realized it was too late. He has not spoken your name since that night, but I see the way he looks at your empty place at the dinner table. He is proud and stubborn, but I believe he is also heartbroken. As for me, I confess I do not understand your choice. The life you left behind was one many girls would envy. But I raised you to think for yourself, even if I never expected you to think quite so independently. If you are truly happy, if this Matthew Young treats you well and loves you as you deserve, then perhaps you made the right choice after all. Please write back to me, daughter. Tell me about your new life, and know that whatever your father says, you always have a mother who loves you." Victoria read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Matthew held her and let her cry, understanding that these were complicated tears, made of sadness and relief and love and loss all mixed together. That night, Victoria composed a reply, writing by lamplight at their small table. She told her mother everything, about their journey to Wyoming, about learning to cook and keep house, about Robert and Sarah and their kindness, about the baby that was coming in the spring. She wrote honestly about the challenges and the hardships, but also about the joy and the love and the sense of purpose she had never felt in her old life. "Tell Father that I am well and happy," she wrote. "Tell him that Matthew is a good man who works hard and loves me completely. Tell him that I do not regret my choice, not for a single moment. And tell him that when his first grandchild is born, he or she will have a place in our home should he ever wish to meet us. The door is always open, even if he closed his." She sent the letter off the next day, not knowing if her father would read it or if her mother would even dare to share it with him. But it felt important to reach out, to keep that thread of connection alive even if it was stretched thin. The winter seemed endless, but finally, spring began to arrive in Wyoming. The snow melted, revealing brown grass that would soon turn green. Wildflowers pushed up through the thawing ground, and the air lost its bitter edge. Victoria's belly grew round and heavy, and she found herself waddling more than walking. Sarah helped her prepare for the birth, showing her what supplies she would need and what to expect. "The first child is always the hardest," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "But women have been doing this since the beginning of time. Your body knows what to do." Victoria was less convinced of this, but she tried to stay calm. Matthew was a wreck, nervously checking on her constantly and jumping at every grimace or complaint. "I am not made of glass," she finally told him one afternoon. "The baby will come when the baby comes, and me fretting about it will not help anything." "I know," he said, "but I cannot help worrying. You are my whole world, Victoria, if anything happened to you." "Nothing will happen to me," she said firmly, hoping it was true. The baby decided to make an appearance on a warm afternoon in early April. Victoria's water broke while she was hanging laundry, and the contractions started soon after. Sarah arrived quickly, along with the town doctor, and Matthew was banished to wait outside with Robert. The labor lasted through the afternoon and into the evening. It was harder and more painful than anything Victoria had ever experienced, but Sarah held her hand and talked her through it, and the doctor remained calm and competent. Finally, just as the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold, Victoria gave one last push and felt the baby slip free. A sharp cry filled the room, strong and loud and indignant at being thrust into the cold world. "It is a boy," the doctor announced, holding up the squirming, red-faced infant. "A healthy baby boy." They cleaned him and wrapped him in a soft blanket, and then Sarah placed him in Victoria's arms. She looked down at her son's tiny face, his eyes squeezed shut and his mouth open in a wail, and felt a love so fierce it was almost frightening. This small person was half her and half Matthew, a living symbol of their love and courage. Matthew was allowed in then, and he approached the bed with something like awe on his face. "A son," he whispered, reaching out to touch the baby's impossibly small hand. "We have a son." "What should we name him?" Victoria asked, exhausted but happier than she had ever been. "James," Matthew said immediately, "after my father. James Robert Young, if that is acceptable to you." "James," Victoria repeated, looking down at her son. "Hello, James. Welcome to the world." Little James was a good baby, crying only when he was hungry or needed changing. Matthew proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with his son when Victoria needed rest, singing old cowboy songs in a surprisingly pleasant baritone. Victoria healed quickly from the birth, and soon was back to her regular routine, though now with the added challenge of caring for an infant. The summer passed in a blur of feedings and diaper changes and sleepless nights, but there were also moments of pure magic. James's first smile, the way he would grip Matthew's finger with surprising strength, the cooing sounds he made when Victoria sang to him. They were a family now, complete and whole. In August, another letter arrived from Victoria's mother. This one was shorter and more cautious in tone. "Your father read your last letter," she wrote. "He did not say anything about it, but I saw his face when I mentioned the baby. He looked almost wistful, though he would never admit it. I think the anger is fading, replaced by something else. Regret, perhaps, or simple sadness at what he has lost. I would very much like to meet my grandson someday. Perhaps if you and Matthew felt comfortable with it, you might bring him to visit. I promise your father would behave himself. He is still stubborn, but he is not cruel. I think seeing you happy would help him understand." Victoria showed the letter to Matthew, and they discussed it long into the night. Part of her yearned to go home, to show her mother the beautiful baby and the good man she had married. But another part was afraid. What if her father rejected them? What if he was cruel to Matthew or dismissive of their life together? "I think we should go," Matthew finally said. "Not for your father, but for you and your mother. She clearly loves you and wants to be part of James's life. And maybe, just maybe, your father will surprise us." "What if he does not? What if it makes everything worse? Then at least we will know we tried. And James will know someday that we did not let pride or fear keep him from knowing his family." So in September, when James was 5 months old and the weather was still fine for traveling, they made the long journey back to Colorado. Victoria's stomach was in knots the entire way, and she second-guessed the decision 100 times. But Matthew remained steady and calm, his presence a source of strength. They arrived in Cherry Creek on a Tuesday afternoon, and the town looked exactly as Victoria remembered it, as if no time had passed at all. But she was different. She was no longer the naive girl who had left in the middle of the night. She was a wife, a mother, a woman who had learned to make her own way in the world. The Hayes mansion loomed on its hill, imposing and beautiful and slightly ridiculous in its ostentation. Victoria took a deep breath, adjusted James in her arms, and walked up the front steps with Matthew beside her. Before she could knock, the door flew open and her mother stood there, tears already streaming down her face. "Victoria," Constance breathed. "Oh, my darling girl." They embraced, carefully so as not to crush the baby between them, and both women wept. When they finally pulled apart, Constance looked at Matthew and smiled through her tears. "You must be Matthew. Thank you for bringing her home." "This is not her home anymore, madam," Matthew said respectfully but firmly. "But she wanted to visit and I wanted to meet you." "Of course," Constance said quickly. "Please come in, both of you, and is this?" She peered at the bundle in Victoria's arms and her face lit up. "Is this James?" "Would you like to hold him?" Victoria asked. Constance took her grandson with the practiced ease of someone who had once been a young mother herself. She gazed down at him with wonder, tracing his features with her eyes. "He has Victoria's eyes," she said. "But your chin, I think, Matthew." They were standing in the entrance hall, having this tender moment, when a door opened down the corridor and Cornelius Hayes emerged from his study. He stopped dead when he saw them, his face going through a series of emotions too quick to read. For a long moment, no one spoke. "Hello, Father," Victoria finally said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Cornelius looked at her, then at Matthew, then at the baby in Constance's arms. "So you came back," he said, his voice neutral. "We came to visit," Victoria corrected. "This is my husband, Matthew Young." "And that is your grandson, James," Cornelius took a few steps closer, his eyes never leaving the baby. "James," he repeated. "That is a strong name." "He was named for Matthew's father," Victoria said. "A man who built something from nothing and left a legacy worth preserving." The implied criticism hung in the air. Cornelius's jaw tightened, but he did not look away. "May I?" he asked, reaching toward the baby. Constance hesitated, then carefully transferred James into his grandfather's arms. Cornelius held the baby with surprising gentleness, and something in his stern face softened. James, who had been fussing slightly, quieted down and stared up at his grandfather with wide, curious eyes. "He is a fine boy," Cornelius said quietly. "Strong and healthy." "We have been blessed," Matthew said. It was the first time he had spoken to Cornelius since that terrible night in the garden, and Victoria felt her heart swell with pride at his calm dignity. Cornelius looked at Matthew properly for the first time. "You are still ranching?" "I work for a friend in Wyoming who breeds horses for the cavalry. It is good, honest work." "And my daughter, what is her life like?" "Hard sometimes," Matthew admitted. "We are not wealthy and we probably never will be. But Victoria is happy and loved and valued for who she is, not what she can bring to a business arrangement." Another pointed statement, and this time Cornelius actually flinched. He looked down at the baby in his arms, then at Victoria, and she saw something crumble in his expression. "I was wrong," he said, and the words seemed to cost him dearly. "Not about everything, but about some things. I wanted you to have security and comfort, Victoria. I wanted you to never know the hardships I experienced in my youth. But in trying to protect you, I forgot to ask what you actually wanted." "I wanted to be seen," Victoria said softly. "I wanted to matter for who I was, not for what I could bring to your empire. I know that now, and I am sorry." He looked at Matthew. "You gave her what I could not. You gave her freedom to be herself. I cannot argue with the results. She looks happier than I have ever seen her." "She is happy," Matthew confirmed, "and we take good care of each other." Cornelius nodded slowly and carefully handed James back to Victoria. "Will you stay for dinner? I know it is asking a lot, but I would like the chance to know you better. Both of you." Victoria looked at Matthew, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod. "We can stay for dinner," she said. The meal was awkward at first, with long silences and careful conversation. But gradually, as the courses came and went, things became easier. Cornelius asked questions about their life in Wyoming, and Matthew answered honestly, neither exaggerating their success nor dwelling on their struggles. Victoria talked about learning to cook and keep house, and she was surprised to see something like respect in her father's eyes. "I was wondering," Cornelius said over dessert, "if you might consider bringing James to visit more often, perhaps quarterly. I would be willing to cover the travel expenses." Victoria exchanged another glance with Matthew. "We would have to discuss it," she said carefully, "but I think we could arrange something." "I would like that," Cornelius said. "And I would like—" He paused, clearly struggling with the words. "I would like to establish a trust for James. Nothing extravagant, but enough to ensure he has opportunities when he gets older. Education, a start in whatever business or trade he chooses." "We do not need charity," Matthew said, his tone not unkind but firm. "It is not charity. It is what a grandfather does for his grandson. You do not have to accept anything for yourselves, but let me do this for the boy." Victoria felt torn. Part of her wanted to refuse on principle, to prove that they did not need her father's money. But another part recognized the gesture for what it was, an attempt at reconciliation, a bridge across the chasm that had opened between them. "We will think about it," she finally said, "and we will discuss what feels right." "That is all I ask," Cornelius said. They left the next morning, with promises to write more often and to visit again in the winter. As they rode away from Cherry Creek, Victoria looked back at the mansion on the hill one last time. It no longer felt like a prison. It was just a house, large and expensive and full of people who were trying in their flawed way to love each other. "That went better than I expected," Matthew said, adjusting James in the sling across his chest. "Father is proud," Victoria said, "but he is not heartless. I think he genuinely wants to make amends." "And what do you think about the trust fund for James?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think we should accept it, but on our terms, not as a crutch or a safety net, but as a gift from a grandfather to his grandson. James should know both sides of his family, the wealthy banker and the hard-working rancher. Both are part of his heritage." "You are wise beyond your years, Mrs. Young," Matthew said, smiling at her. "I had to be," she replied. "I married a stubborn cowboy who convinced me to give up everything for love. Do you regret it?" Even for a moment. She thought about the question seriously, considering everything that had happened in the past year. The fear and uncertainty, the hard work and the exhaustion, the nights when their money ran low and the future seemed uncertain. But she also thought about the joy and the love and the sense of purpose that filled her days. She thought about James's smile and Matthew's steady presence and the life they were building together, brick by brick. "No," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. I would do it all again in a heartbeat." They returned to Wyoming and fell back into their routine. The seasons turned, James grew and thrived, and Victoria and Matthew's love deepened with each passing day. They visited Cherry Creek twice a year, and gradually the relationship with Victoria's parents healed. Cornelius never became warm exactly, but he was present and generous in his own way. And Constance delighted in being a grandmother, sending packages of clothes and toys that Victoria graciously accepted. 2 years after James was born, Victoria discovered she was pregnant again. This time there was no fear, only joy. She knew what to expect now, knew her own strength. Their daughter was born in the autumn of 1881, a tiny thing with Matthew's dark hair and a fierce determination that showed itself from the moment she emerged. They named her Elizabeth Ann, after Matthew's mother, and she was the perfect complement to her serious older brother. Where James was cautious and thoughtful, Elizabeth was bold and adventurous. Before she could walk, she was trying to climb out of her cradle. Before she could talk properly, she was demanding to go outside and see the horses. In 1883, Robert Morrison offered to sell Matthew and Victoria a portion of his land, 100 acres on the western edge of his property. He gave them favorable terms, and with some money from the trust Cornelius had established, along with their own savings, they were able to accept. Matthew spent every spare moment building them a proper house, something more substantial than the cabin they had been living in. The house was not large or fancy, but it was solid and well built, with glass windows and a wide porch and a kitchen that Victoria helped design. They moved in on a crisp November day, carrying their few possessions and their 2 children into their very own home on their very own land. "I told you I would build you a house someday," Matthew said as they stood on the porch that first evening, watching the sun set over their property. "You keep your promises," Victoria said, leaning against him while James and Elizabeth played at their feet. "Always," he replied, kissing the top of her head. Over the next few years, they built up their ranch slowly and carefully. Matthew had a gift for training horses, and word spread. Soon, he was getting requests from army forts and private buyers across Wyoming and beyond. Victoria managed the books and the household, and as the children got older, she began teaching them to read and write and do arithmetic. She had once been educated by expensive tutors, and now she passed that knowledge on to her children in their simple ranch house. Life was not always easy. There were droughts that withered the grass and harsh winters that killed livestock. There were lean times when they had to stretch every dollar and fat times when they could afford small luxuries. Through it all, they had each other. Matthew's steady strength and quiet wisdom, Victoria's fierce determination and surprising resourcefulness, and their children's laughter and love. In 1885, tragedy struck when Robert Morrison was killed in an accident with a spooked horse. Matthew and Victoria mourned their friend deeply, but they also helped Sarah through her grief, taking on extra work so she could keep the ranch running until her eldest son was old enough to manage it properly. "Robert gave us our start," Matthew said at the funeral. "He believed in us when we had nothing but hope and determination. The least we can do is help his family in return." That was who Matthew was, Victoria thought. A man who remembered kindnesses and repaid them. A man who worked hard and loved deeply and never forgot where he came from. In 1888, when James was 10 and Elizabeth was 7, Victoria gave birth to twin boys. The pregnancy had been difficult, and the birth even more so, but both babies emerged healthy and howling. They named them Robert, after their lost friend, and William, after one of Matthew's brothers who had died young. 4 children, Matthew said, holding one twin while Victoria nursed the other. "We are becoming quite the family. Do you mind?" Victoria asked. She was 30 years old now, and though she loved her children fiercely, she sometimes felt the weight of responsibility for so many young lives. "Mind. Victoria, you have given me everything I could ever want. A home, a family, a life worth living. How could I mind?" The twins were a handful, identical in appearance but different in temperament. Robert was quiet and observant, while William was loud and demanding. Combined with James's increasing desire for independence and Elizabeth's boundless energy, the household was chaotic and messy and full of noise. Victoria sometimes thought back to her quiet, ordered life in Cherry Creek and marveled at how much had changed. She had once spent her days reading novels and doing needlework and attending tea parties. Now her days were full of cooking and cleaning and teaching and refereeing squabbles and tending scraped knees. She was exhausted more often than not. Her hands were always rough, and her dresses were years out of fashion. But she had never been happier. In the spring of 1890, Cornelius Hayes came to visit on his own, without Constance. He was older now, slower, and there was a gravitas about him that had not been there before. He spent a week at the ranch, watching his daughter and son-in-law work, playing with his grandchildren, and generally observing their life without comment. On his last evening, he sat with Matthew and Victoria on the porch after the children had gone to bed. "I owe you both an apology," he said without preamble. "One I should have offered years ago. You apologized when we visited after James was born," Victoria reminded him. "That was for my immediate behavior, for trying to control your life and threatening Matthew." He paused, looking out at the darkening landscape. "But I never apologized for my blindness, for being so focused on money and status that I almost destroyed the best thing in my life. Father, let me finish, Victoria, please." He took a breath. "When you left, I was furious. Not just angry, but truly enraged. I felt betrayed, embarrassed, and worried about what people would say. It took me years to realize that I was really angry at myself, for failing to see who you were, what you needed, for treating you like a possession instead of a person." "You loved me the best way you knew how," Victoria said gently. "Perhaps. But it was not good enough." He turned to Matthew. "You saw her in a way I never did. You saw her strength and her courage, and you gave her the freedom to become who she was meant to be. For that I will always be grateful to you. Matthew, who had been quiet throughout this speech, finally spoke. "She did not need me to set her free, sir. She freed herself. I just had the good fortune to be there when she did." Cornelius smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "You are a good man, Matthew Young. I was wrong about you, and I am glad to have been proven wrong." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast Wyoming sky. Finally, Cornelius said, "I am revising my will. I wanted to tell you before I file the papers. I am leaving the bulk of my estate to charity, but there will be provisions for Victoria and the children. Not enough to make you wealthy, but enough to provide security." "That is generous," Matthew said. "It is fair," Cornelius corrected. "Victoria is my daughter, and those children are my grandchildren. They should benefit from the wealth I have accumulated, even if they do not need it to be happy." He looked at Victoria with something like wonder. "You figured out what took me a lifetime to learn. That happiness does not come from money or status or power. It comes from love and purpose and building something that matters." "Yes," Victoria said simply. "It does." Cornelius left the next morning, and Victoria had a feeling it would be the last time she saw him. He was 72 years old and his health was failing, though he tried to hide it. She hugged him tightly before he climbed into the carriage that would take him to the train station. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. "And thank you for understanding, finally." "Thank you for being brave enough to teach me," he replied. He died 6 months later, peacefully in his sleep. Victoria and Matthew made the long journey to Cherry Creek for the funeral, bringing all 4 children with them. The service was well attended, full of business associates and social acquaintances who spoke of Cornelius's acumen and success. But in the private family gathering afterward, it was Victoria who gave the real eulogy. "My father was a complicated man," she said, standing in the parlor of her childhood home with her children gathered around her. "He made mistakes, as we all do, but he also tried to learn from them. He was proud and stubborn and sometimes blind to what mattered most. But in the end, he learned to see. He learned to value love over money, family over status, and happiness over success. That is the legacy I will remember." Constance moved in with Victoria and Matthew after Cornelius's death. She was only 61 and still had many years ahead of her, but she had no desire to stay in the big house in Cherry Creek without her husband. She sold the mansion and most of its contents, keeping only a few treasured items, and settled into a small room in Victoria and Matthew's ranch house. "Are you sure about this, Mother?" Victoria asked as they unpacked Constance's trunks. "It is a far cry from what you are used to." "What I am used to is being alone in a house full of memories," Constance replied. "Here I have family. I have grandchildren who need spoiling and a daughter I want to know better. That is worth more than any mansion." Constance proved to be a blessing to the household. She helped with the children, taught Elizabeth to sew and the boys to be gentlemen, and generally made herself useful in dozens of small ways. She and Victoria, who had always had a cordial but distant relationship, became true friends. They would sit together in the evenings after the work was done, talking about everything and nothing, making up for lost time. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growing children. James proved to have his father's talent with horses and his grandfather's head for business. By the time he was 16, he was managing much of the ranch's finances and negotiating deals with buyers. Elizabeth was wild and free, more comfortable in the barn than the house, with a gift for healing injured animals that suggested she might become a veterinarian someday. The twins were 10 in 1898 when Victoria discovered, to her shock and delight, that she was pregnant again at age 40. The pregnancy was harder than her previous ones, and Matthew worried constantly, but Victoria was determined. Their fifth child, another daughter, was born in the spring of 1899. They named her Grace because that was what her arrival felt like, an unexpected gift, unearned but cherished. 5 children, Matthew said, cradling tiny Grace while Victoria recovered. I think we might be done now. I think you might be right, Victoria agreed, laughing. I am not sure I have the energy for another. But Grace proved to be an easy baby, perhaps sensing that her parents were older and more tired than they had been. She was content to be passed from sibling to sibling, doted on by her grandmother, and generally loved by the entire family. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1898, Matthew took Victoria on a rare trip away from the ranch. They left the children in Constance's capable hands and rode out to a beautiful spot in the mountains, where a clear lake reflected the sky like a mirror. "Do you remember what I said to you the first time I proposed?" Matthew asked as they sat by the water, hand in hand. "You said you did not have a ring or a fortune, but you had 2 hands willing to work and a heart that belonged only to me. And I promised to spend every day trying to make you happy. Did I keep that promise?" Victoria turned to look at him. He was 42 now, with threads of silver in his dark hair and lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun. He was as lean and strong as ever, his hands still calloused from work, his eyes still warm and deep. He was the same man who had stood in his barn 20 years ago and captured her heart, and also someone entirely different, shaped by 2 decades of love and labor and life. "You kept your promise," she said. "Every single day." "Good," he said, "because I plan to keep keeping it for as long as I live." He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple gold ring with a tiny diamond. "Matthew, what is this?" "It is the ring I should have given you 20 years ago. I have been saving for it, a little bit at a time. I wanted you to have something beautiful, something that showed the world you are loved and cherished." Victoria felt tears slip down her cheeks as he slipped the ring onto her finger next to the plain gold band she had worn since their wedding day. "It is perfect," she whispered. "You are perfect." "I am far from perfect," he said, smiling, "but I am perfectly yours." They made love under the stars that night, with the tenderness and passion of 2 people who had built a life together through joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle. And afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, Victoria thought about the girl she had been, standing on those bank steps in her silk dress, watching a poor cowboy count out his meager earnings. That girl had dreamed of something more, something real. And she had found it, against all odds and expectations. She had found love and purpose and a life that mattered. She had found Matthew. The years continued to turn. James married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property and gave Victoria and Matthew their first grandchild in 1902. Elizabeth shocked everyone by announcing she was going to veterinary school in Denver, one of the first women to attempt it. The twins grew into strong, capable young men, different in temperament but united in their love of the ranch. And Grace, their surprise baby, grew into a bright, curious child who asked endless questions and read every book she could get her hands on. Constance lived to be 78, long enough to see all her grandchildren grown and several great-grandchildren born. She died peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1913, surrounded by the family she had chosen over the empty trappings of wealth and status. "She was happy here," Victoria said at the funeral, holding Matthew's hand tightly. "She told me once that moving to the ranch was the best decision she ever made." "She was a good woman," Matthew said, "and a wonderful grandmother." Victoria leaned against her husband, drawing comfort from his solid presence. They were both in their 50s now, no longer young but not yet old. The ranch was prosperous. Their children were thriving, and the love between them had only deepened with time. In 1918, as the Great War raged in Europe and the world seemed to be falling apart, Victoria and Matthew celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. Their children organized a party, gathering at the ranch with their spouses and children, and the house was full of noise and laughter and love. James, now 36 and the father of 4, stood up to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us that the best things in life are not bought with money, but built with love and hard work. Who showed us that courage means following your heart, even when the world tells you not to. Who gave us the greatest gift any child can receive, the example of a marriage built on mutual respect and true partnership. To Victoria and Matthew Young." "To Victoria and Matthew," the room echoed, and Victoria felt her eyes fill with tears. Later, when the party had wound down and the grandchildren were sleeping in various corners of the house, Victoria and Matthew walked out to the porch, just as they had so many times over the years. 40 years, Victoria said, looking out at the ranch they had built together. The house Matthew had constructed with his own hands, the barns and corrals and fences that had been mended and rebuilt and improved, the land that they had worked and shaped and loved into prosperity. Can you believe it? "Some days it feels like 40 years, Matthew said, slipping his arm around her waist. "And some days it feels like we just got married yesterday. You ever wonder what would have happened if I had not come to your ranch that day, if I had just stayed in my safe, comfortable life?" "I try not to think about it," Matthew admitted, "because imagining a life without you is too painful to contemplate." "I would have married Charles Thornton," Victoria said, "or someone like him. I would have lived in a big house and thrown elegant parties and been desperately unhappy. And I never would have known what I was missing." "But you did know," Matthew said. "Somehow you knew there was something more. You were brave enough to reach for it." "We were both brave," she corrected. "You could have sent me away that first day, told me to go back to my safe life. But you let me in. You saw me. How could I not? You were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and not just on the outside. You had this light inside you, this hunger for something real. I recognized it because I felt it too." They stood in silence for a while, comfortable in each other's presence as only two people who have shared decades of life can be. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had watched them fall in love, get married, build a life, raise a family. "No regrets?" Matthew asked softly. "Not a single one," Victoria replied. "Only gratitude. For you, for our children, for this life we built together. It has not always been easy, but it has always been worth it." "Always," Matthew agreed, and he kissed her in the starlight, 40 years of love in that single gesture. They lived on the ranch for another 15 years, watching their grandchildren grow and their great-grandchildren be born. Matthew's hair turned completely silver, and Victoria's face gained lines that mapped out decades of laughter and love. Their bodies grew slower, their joints more creaky, but their love remained constant. Matthew died in the spring of 1933 at the age of 77. He had been working with a young horse, doing what he loved, when his heart simply stopped. Victoria was with him at the end, holding his hand as he slipped away. "I love you," were his last words. "I have loved you from the first moment, and I will love you beyond the last." "And I love you," Victoria whispered through her tears, "always and forever." She buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, where he could watch over the land he had loved and the family he had built. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, friends and family and business associates, all coming to pay their respects to a man who had lived with integrity and died with dignity. Victoria lived for another 5 years after Matthew's death, spending her time with her children and grandchildren, telling stories about the early days and keeping her husband's memory alive. She never remarried, never even considered it. Matthew had been her great love, her partner, her soulmate, and she was content to live out her remaining years wrapped in the memories of their time together. She died peacefully in her sleep in the summer of 1938 at the age of 80. Her children buried her beside Matthew on the hill, under a simple stone that read, "Victoria Henrietta Young, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, and friend. She chose love over comfort, courage over convention, and built a life that mattered." At the funeral, Elizabeth, now a respected veterinarian and grandmother herself, told the story of her mother's flight from Cherry Creek, of the banker's daughter who had the courage to flee and marry a poor cowboy. "She gave up everything for love," Elizabeth said. "And in doing so, she gained everything that truly mattered. She taught us that wealth is not measured in dollars but in relationships, that success is not about status but about living authentically, and that the bravest thing any of us can do is to follow our hearts, no matter where they lead us." The ranch continued on, passed down through the generations. James's son ran it after him, and then his grandson after that. The original house that Matthew built still stands, preserved by the family as a reminder of where they came from and what their grandparents sacrificed to build a legacy of love. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispers through the Wyoming grass and the stars come out one by one, it is said that you can still feel the presence of Victoria and Matthew, two souls who found each other against all odds and built a life that would echo through generations. Their love story became legend in the family, told and retold to each new generation, a reminder that true love is worth any sacrifice, any hardship, any challenge, because in the end, they proved that love is not about wealth or status or living up to others' expectations. Love is about seeing another person truly, valuing them completely, and building a life together based on mutual respect and shared dreams. It is about having the courage to choose happiness over comfort, authenticity over appearance, and each other over everything else. Victoria and Matthew Young lived that truth every single day of their 40 years together, and their descendants carried that truth forward, a precious inheritance worth more than all the gold in her father's bank ever could have been.